Somewhere in the middle of a vast, gray Russian lake, a small wooden boat cut silently through the cold water. Two men were rowing toward a massive cargo ship anchored in the distance, chasing the only thing that mattered to them that morning: money. The lake was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like a warning. But neither man was listening. They had bills to pay, debts to carry, and pride too stubborn to admit how bad things had truly become. What they didn't know was that this single trip would be the beginning of something none of them could ever have imagined. When they finally reached the ship, a man named Valera greeted them with a grin and an offer that sounded almost too good. "Over a ton of premium caviar," he said, waiting to be moved. Oleg's eyes lit up immediately. He could already feel the money in his hands. He grabbed his older partner by the shoulder, practically begging him to agree. But the old man hesitated, studying their small, aging boat with the eyes of someone who had seen the water win before. The weight was too much, too dangerous, too foolish. And yet, after a long silence, he nodded. Sometimes desperation is louder than wisdom. They loaded every crate onto the boat and set off across the lake. Oleg, unable to contain his excitement, even cracked open one of the crates and started eating the caviar mid-journey, laughing like a man who had already won. But the lake had no interest in his celebration. Slowly, the boat began to groan beneath the weight. Then it started to tilt. Then it started to sink. Oleg scrambled to save the cargo, grabbing at crates slipping beneath the surface, but the water was faster and colder and completely unforgiving. One by one, every single crate disappeared into the dark depths of the lake, and there was nothing left to do but survive. They made it to shore, soaking and empty-handed. The old man didn't say a word at first. He just stared at the place where his boat used to be, and then he turned to Oleg with fury burning in his eyes. The argument was short and brutal. In the end, Oleg handed over the keys to his car, the last thing he owned, standing in a parking lot with nothing but wet clothes and a mountain of debt. He walked away from that moment a man completely stripped of everything, except for one last desperate idea forming quietly in the back of his mind. The next morning, Oleg found his girlfriend Sveta outside her bank, and one look at his face told her everything. He was drowning, not in lake water this time, but in debt, in pressure, in the kind of panic that makes people say things they never thought they would. He asked her for another loan, and she refused, gently but firmly. No bank would touch him now, she explained. His record was too broken, his debts too deep. Then, in a moment that revealed just how desperate he had become, he leaned in close and asked her something that made her step back. He wanted her to steal the money from inside the bank. Sveta looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head and walked away. Later that day, after exhausting every other possibility in his mind, Oleg agreed to do the one thing his pride had refused. He would go and ask Boris, Sveta's father, for help. The old man had a house that the family had been urging him to sell for years. It felt like begging, and Oleg hated every step of the drive there. When they arrived, Boris was crouched over a broken toilet, grumbling to himself while the rest of the family moved around him like planets around a tired sun. The house felt lived in, loud, and full of old arguments. Oleg pulled Boris aside, and the moment the words left his mouth, the room exploded. Voices overlapped, accusations flew, and within seconds what began as a private conversation became a full family war. And then the sky broke open. High above the city, a meteorite tore through the atmosphere, burning white and orange as it split into fragments and screamed toward the earth. Nobody inside the house noticed, not at first. They were still too busy shouting. But then one of those fragments came straight through the roof, crashing into the room with a force that shook the walls and sent everyone flying backward. It struck Pavel, the grandfather, with enough impact to send him crashing through the floorboards. For a moment, complete silence. Then chaos. Everyone ran outside, convinced they were being attacked, only to look up and see streaks of fire cutting across the sky above the entire city. It was raining meteors. When they rushed back inside to check on Pavel, the old man was still breathing. Barely, but breathing. Boris knelt beside him and confirmed what it was: not a weapon, not an attack, a meteor. The second Oleg heard that word, something shifted behind his eyes. While everyone else worried about the old man, Oleg was already thinking about what that rock might be worth on the black market. He told them all to start digging. And so, in the middle of the night, this battered Russian family got on their knees and dug through the dirt beneath their home, chasing a rock from outer space because hope, however strange its shape, was still hope. One by one, as the hours crawled by, each family member gave up and went to sleep. But not Oleg. He kept digging, driven by a desperation that went far deeper than exhaustion. By the time pale morning light crept through the windows, his hands were raw and his back was broken. But he had found it. A dark, heavy chunk of something that had traveled millions of miles to land in this exact house. He rushed upstairs, ready to announce his victory. But before he could say a word, Pavel's voice stopped him. The old man lay still on his bed, his breathing shallow, his eyes half closed. He told Oleg, calmly and without fear, that he could feel himself fading, that his time had come. Oleg reached for his phone to call an ambulance, but Pavel shook his head. He had lived fully, he said. He had no regrets. And then, quietly, he was gone. Oleg stood there in the silence of that room, completely still. Death had walked in and out so quickly he hadn't even had time to prepare for it. He turned to wake Sveta and tell her, but she wouldn't stir, no matter how hard he shook her. Something was wrong, but he couldn't name it. What he didn't know was that downstairs, the meteor had changed. The solid rock he had dug up with bleeding hands had dissolved overnight into a thick, glowing purple liquid pooling quietly in the dirt. It had already done its work. Something had moved through this house while everyone slept, and nothing would ever be the same again. When Oleg finally came back downstairs, Tok met him with wide, frightened eyes. He said something had gone terribly wrong in the house. Sveta was gone from her bed. The purple liquid had been accidentally spilled across the floor. And little Sasha, the youngest in the family, was standing in the corner holding a bent metal rod she had snapped with her bare hands like it was a dry twig. Oleg stared. Sasha stared back. Then she snapped another piece of metal, just to be sure. The fear and confusion that moved through Oleg in that moment was unlike anything he had ever felt, because somewhere deep underneath the fear, something else was waking up. Something that smelled like possibility. He found Sveta's voice before he found her body. She was speaking from inside their bedroom, but she wasn't there. Or rather, she was there, just invisible. Half of her had vanished completely, like someone had erased her from the middle of a photograph. Before Oleg could even begin to process that, screaming broke out downstairs. He ran down to find Rita pressed against the ceiling, floating helplessly, unable to come back to earth. Boris smashed the door open in a panic and they pulled her down, and for a brief moment, the whole family stood in the dining room staring at each other in pure, terrified silence. Then Pavel walked in. The grandfather who had died upstairs just hours before walked through the doorway, confused and very much alive. And the silence became a scream. The chaos that followed was total. In the middle of all the panic, Rita drifted upward again, floated through the hole in the roof, and sailed out into the open sky above the neighborhood. But the moment she moved too far from the house, her power cut out midair. She dropped to the ground, hard. At the exact same moment inside, Sveta became fully visible again, and Pavel collapsed for the second time. When they brought Rita back, the family sat together in stunned quiet and slowly pieced together what the meteor had done to them. Powers had been given: flight, invisibility, immortality, super strength. And something else was clear. These powers only worked when they stayed close together. Oleg and Tok alone had nothing. Or so they thought. The hospital offered no answers. The doctor laughed off radiation, called his own meter useless, and sent them home with a prescription for vitamins. So the family returned to their broken house and tried to make sense of a new and impossible life. At dinner that night, Rita half-jokingly suggested they join a circus. Tok mocked her. Rita lunged at him. Sasha casually bent her grandfather's metal cane in half. And Pavel, freshly resurrected and already exhausted by it, chased her around the table with what remained of it. It would have been funny if it hadn't been so completely insane. But then later that night, something quieter happened. Toke went outside to feed his dogs, still grumbling under his breath, and stopped mid-step. One of the dogs was barking, and Toke understood every single word of it. He had found his power. He could speak to animals. He ran inside laughing, and for one brief, beautiful moment, the whole family forgot to be afraid. The next morning delivered another shock. Oleg walked into Pavel's room and found the old man hanging from a rope tied to the ceiling beam. He wasn't dead. He couldn't die. He just hung there, patient and calm, and asked Oleg politely if he wouldn't mind helping him down. Meanwhile, Boris discovered his own ability when a trip to the bathroom sent him teleporting straight outside the house in his pajamas. He came back inside, tried again, and ended up in the garden. He stood there for a long moment before deciding he needed to go fishing and process this quietly. He suggested they all go with him, and nobody argued. Out by the lake, while Rita looped and soared above the water, and Toke sat with his dog watching videos, Oleg pulled Boris aside and laid out a plan that had been growing in his mind since the beginning. $3 million. Svita's invisibility. Her own bank vault. Boris could teleport inside. Rita could provide a distraction. It was clean, fast, and it would end all of Oleg's problems in a single afternoon. Boris looked at him for a long time, then refused. He was tired of Oleg's disasters becoming everyone else's emergencies. Oleg walked away in frustration, and the moment he stepped too far from the group, Pavel dropped dead on the riverbank and Rita fell out of the sky into the water. Oleg turned back slowly, and without a word, made sure everyone understood. If he left, the powers left with him. The confrontation was cut short when Oleg and Svita were surrounded on a quiet road by criminal enforcers. Valera appeared, unhurried and smiling, and invited Oleg onto his private jet for a conversation. Inside, the smile disappeared. The message was simple and terrifying. Pay back the caviar debt, or be shipped to China and sold for parts. Oleg stepped off that jet with the color drained from his face. Svita saw his expression and didn't ask questions. She wrapped her arms around him, and when he told her everything, she closed her eyes for a moment. Then she told him she would help with the bank. That night, the family gathered and, against every instinct that usually governs reasonable people, they agreed to commit robbery together. And then they celebrated. They danced, they laughed, they made noise late into the night, and for a few hours they were not criminals or debtors or supernatural accidents. They were just a family. The kind that faces impossible things together and somehow still finds reasons to laugh. The first attempt at the robbery was a beautiful disaster. Svita memorized the vault code while invisible inside the bank. Everything was going perfectly until a police officer decided their getaway car was blocking traffic and physically pushed it down the street with his own vehicle. The distance broke the connection. Pavel dropped. Svita materialized out of thin air in the middle of the bank floor. Customers screamed. Boris teleported directly into the back seat of a police cruiser. They escaped, barely, through a combination of luck and confusion, and returned home shaken and empty-handed. Boris stood in the living room afterward, his jaw tight, and told them plainly they would not stop until this was finished, and next time there would be no mistakes. Before the second attempt, there was Rita. She had a performance that night, and instead of encouragement, the family delivered ridicule. She disappeared into the bathroom trying to hold herself together, and Oleg, who understood what it felt like to be the one everyone underestimated, quietly stood up and said he would go. At the theater, Rita's nerves betrayed her. She launched into the air and immediately lost control, bouncing off walls and rafters while the audience watched in stunned confusion. In the chaos backstage, Valera found Oleg and beat him methodically while the theater manager watched through the curtain and decided it was all part of the show. When Oleg finally emerged, broken and bleeding, he looked at his family and said things he couldn't take back. He called them selfish. He said they were useless even with powers. He ended things with Svita and said he was done. But Boris grabbed him by the arm before he could walk away. The robbery was happening tonight. That was final. What followed was something between a heist and a miracle. Rita tore through a wall with a chain. Sasha shoved a truck into the alley like furniture. Boris teleported directly into the vault room. Sveta punched in the memorized code, and the door swung open. Outside, Pavel bought time by drinking gasoline and breathing fire at 3 bewildered drunk men who would spend the rest of the week questioning their own sanity. Tok unleashed every dog in the area to delay the police. Sasha threw the safe out of the building like a paper bag. They loaded the money, piled into the car, and vanished into the dark streets of the city. On the way out, Pavel threw fistfuls of stolen cash toward homeless people huddled under bridges, and the police, bless them, gave chase to entirely the wrong group of people. They drove to a cliff at the edge of the city, the kind of place that feels separate from the world below, and they stood there in the wind, counting their new lives. Then Pavel stepped forward and said his goodbyes, one by one, slowly, gently. He walked to the edge and stepped off without ceremony. The family stood in silence for a long moment before turning and walking to the car. It was only when they were pulling away that Rita looked back and saw him already standing up again at the bottom, furious, brushing gravel off his coat and yelling at them to just leave him alone. Some men cannot escape life, no matter how hard they try. But even freedom, it turned out, came with conditions. Boris suggested they buy a big house together, one roof, one family, one beginning. One by one, they all declined. They had money now. They had plans. They had directions that didn't include each other. Boris listened to each refusal quietly, and for the first time in the entire story, this man who had survived everything looked genuinely lost. Then Pavel, from somewhere nearby, dropped the news that he had already called the police on all of them and that they had about 4 minutes to disappear. They ran. In the car, Sveta handed Oleg his share of the money in a clean envelope and told him she was done. Not cruel, not loud, just done. She asked him to get out.
He did.
He paid Valera, cleared his debt, packed a single bag, and walked toward the airport like a man who had finally figured out how to move forward by leaving everything behind. He was standing at his gate when a breaking news alert lit up every screen in the terminal. Sveta and her family had been arrested trying to retrieve Pavel's body from a city morgue. He stared at the screen for a very long time. Then he picked up his bag and walked back out into the city. What came next was loud and glorious and completely illegal. Oleg and Pavel broke into the courthouse together, and the moment the family was reunited through those walls, every power blazed back to life. Pavel rose from a metal table like a man with unfinished business. Sasha tore through cell doors like paper. Boris sent a security guard somewhere cold and far away with a thought. They poured out of that building in a wave of chaos and extraordinary ability, and the police waiting outside had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to them. The chase through the city was the kind of thing that would have been dismissed as fiction if a dozen police cameras hadn't captured every second of it. Boris crashed one pursuit vehicle by teleporting its driver out of the seat mid-turn. Sasha threw another car off the road with one hand. Oleg used his ridiculous, much-mocked, water-shooting fingers to clean the windshield at 70 miles an hour so he could see where he was going, and somehow in that moment, even he had to laugh. When they were completely surrounded with nowhere left to go, Rita grabbed the entire car from underneath and lifted it into the sky. The police looked up. The city looked up. And then the car was gone, rising above the rooftops and disappearing into the clouds like a dream that had decided to become real. Later, on a quiet dock outside the city, Oleg shook Valera's hand, and this time there was no threat in it. Valera had made quiet arrangements, a cargo ship, forged documents, a container large enough for a family that had stopped making sense within the boundaries of any normal country. They climbed inside together, all of them, even Pavel, even Boris, who had never once agreed to any of this and had ended up at the center of all of it. The container doors closed. The ship moved. And somewhere in the dark of that metal box, crossing a sea towards somewhere unknown, this family, poor, broken, gifted, criminal, and somehow still together, finally went quiet. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for something to change. This family had a meteor fall through their roof, and even then, it took robbery, heartbreak, a police chase, and a flying car before they figured out what they actually meant to each other. The powers were never the miracle. The miracle was that they stayed.